I returned from a weekend retreat to a nightmare scene. My family farm overrun with strangers in tactical gear, shooting paintballs across my open fields. There on my front lawn stood Margaret, the HOA president, red headband around her head, pointing at my property as if she owned every acre of it. She believed turning my peaceful sanctuary into a war zone would force me to sell and leave. What she failed to understand was that challenging a former Special Reconnaissance expert on his own terrain wasn't just foolish. It was the mistake that would cost her everything. Did they really think they could ambush the man who trained others in counter-ambush tactics? After serving 25 years in the military, all I wanted was peace and quiet. That's why I bought this 15-acre farm 3 years ago. It wasn't just a property to me, it was my therapy. The doctors at the VA suggested finding something meaningful to do with my hands. Something that would ground me after years of combat operations left me with PTSD that medication alone couldn't fix. Working this land changed everything for me. Maintaining the expansive lawns, caring for the landscape, creating a pristine natural space. There's something healing about tending to the earth instead of seeing it destroyed. I started hosting small community events on my well-kept grounds, and even began offering my space for veterans gatherings and therapy sessions. For the first time since retiring, I felt like I had purpose again. When I purchased the property, I knew it was part of an unusual HOA that covered several properties in the area. It was originally set up to maintain the rural character of the neighborhood while allowing some development. Most of my neighbors were friendly, hardworking people who respected each other's space and property rights. Some were even veterans themselves. They appreciated my self-sufficiency and contributions to the community. I'd deliberately chosen this place for its peaceful setting. The rolling hills reminded me of the countryside where I grew up before joining the military at 18. The forest on the northern edge of my property gave me privacy, and the open fields to the south gave me the space I needed. After years of being confined to military bases and combat zones, having this wide open space was freedom I treasured every day. Everything was fine until 6 months ago when the HOA elected a new board. Margaret Hilton ran an aggressive campaign, promising to elevate the community's prestige. She won by a slim margin in an election with suspicious timing that many working residents couldn't attend. Within weeks, the atmosphere changed. I didn't share much about my military background with my neighbors. They knew I was a veteran, but I never discussed my specialized training or that I spent most of my career in Special Reconnaissance. We're the ones who go in before others, map the terrain, assess threats, and prepare the battlefield. I never thought those skills would be needed in civilian life. I was wrong. The first hint that something was off came when Margaret made a point of stopping by my farm, uninvited, to introduce herself as the new HOA president. The way she surveyed my property, clipboard in hand, felt less like a friendly visit and more like reconnaissance of her own. Your agricultural activities are somewhat unsuitable for the community vision we're developing, Margaret said during that first visit, her voice dripping with fake concern. She stood at the edge of my vegetable field in her pristine white pants and designer sunglasses, looking at my tomato plants like they were weeds. This property has been zoned for agricultural use since before the HOA existed, I replied calmly, and the bylaws specifically protect existing agricultural activities. She gave me a tight smile. Bylaws can be amended, Mr. Miller. Times change, communities evolve. I didn't think much of it until the following week when I received my first violation notice for excessive agricultural equipment visible from the road. My tractor had been parked in the same spot for 3 years without complaint. Through a neighbor who worked at the county clerk's office, I learned something interesting. Margaret's husband was a senior executive at Lakeside Resort Development Company, which had been buying properties in the surrounding area. Even more telling, her son Jason owned Tactical Zone, a struggling paintball business across town that had just lost its lease. These weren't coincidences. These were motives. When Margaret attempted to pass a new rule restricting home-based businesses that would have prevented me from selling at the farmer's market, I was ready. I'd spent the week quietly speaking with other neighbors who relied on home businesses, the retired teacher who sold handmade crafts, the mechanic who fixed cars in his garage, the woman who ran a small bakery from her kitchen. At the next HOA meeting, we showed up in force. Margaret's face when 15 of us walked in together was my first small victory. The motion was defeated 18-5. "This isn't over," she muttered as she brushed past me after the meeting. She was right. The next morning, I found my irrigation system mysteriously damaged, pipes cut in several places. My security cameras had been turned away just enough to miss capturing whoever did it. Too precise to be random vandalism. The anonymous complaints started flooding into the HOA. My chicken coop was unsightly. My compost pile created offensive odors. My delivery truck created excessive traffic. Each complaint meant a new inspection, new paperwork, new headaches. I installed more security cameras, covering every angle of my property. A week later, while reviewing footage, I caught Margaret herself walking the perimeter of my farm, taking photos while I was at my monthly VA appointment. She was trespassing, but carefully staying just at the property line. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The situation escalated when I discovered through a sympathetic HOA board member that a secret meeting had been held without proper notification to all homeowners. Margaret had pushed through a vote on new community recreation bylaws, claiming they were urgent amendments needed for summer activities. But the real revelation came when I was helping set up for a community event at the local center. In the meeting room, Margaret had left behind a folder. Inside were architectural drawings of my property, not as it was, but reimagined as a recreational facility with parking lots and pavilions. In the corner was the logo of her son's paintball business. I photographed everything before returning the folder helpfully to Margaret, watching her face pale slightly when she realized what I might have seen. "Planning some renovations?" I asked innocently. "Just some preliminary concepts," she said smoothly. "For community consideration." "Interesting that you'd have concepts drawn up for my private property," I replied, "especially without discussing it with me first." She recovered quickly. "Oh, these are just general ideas for the neighborhood. Nothing specific." But we both knew that was a lie. The battle lines were being drawn, and Margaret had just revealed her endgame. She wanted my land, and she would use the HOA to get it. What she didn't know was that I'd spent my military career identifying enemy intentions from the smallest clues. And I'd just confirmed hers. The veteran support retreat had been on my calendar for months. 3 days at a lakeside camp with other vets, fishing, talking, and working through our shared experiences with trained counselors. It was the first time in weeks I felt the tension in my shoulders release. That peace was shattered the moment I turned onto my driveway Sunday afternoon. The sound hit me first, the distinctive popping of paintball markers firing in rapid succession. Then the sight. Dozens of people in tactical gear running across my fields, hiding behind hay bales that had been arranged into barriers, and shooting colorful paint at each other across the well-maintained grass I'd spent months caring for. I parked by my barn, which now had a banner reading Tactical Zone Championship Course hanging from it. Pure rage rose in my throat as I saw the trampled vegetables. The paint splattered across my equipment, the muddy tire tracks from vehicles driven across my eastern field. And there she was. Margaret stood on my front lawn wearing khaki shorts and a red headband, clipboard in hand, directing people where to set up a refreshment tent. Her son Jason was gesturing excitedly to a group of players, pointing out features of the course they'd created on my land. I approached Margaret, my fury contained but visible. This was the moment captured in the thumbnail, me in my denim shirt, having grabbed a discarded paintball marker from the ground, confronting Margaret with her red headband as she gestured dismissively toward my property, the paintball obstacles visible behind us. "What the hell do you think you're doing on my property?" I demanded, the paintball gun held firmly at my side. Margaret's smile was all triumph. "Oh, welcome back. You missed the exciting news. The HOA has designated certain properties as community recreation areas under our emergency bylaw provisions." She handed me a document. "Your property's perfect for our weekend paintball tournaments. Don't worry, we'll be sure to clean up." Mostly. I scanned the document, immediately spotting multiple legal problems. "This is completely illegal. You can't just seize private property for recreational use." "We're not seizing anything," Margaret said, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes cold. "We're utilizing community resources for community benefit." Section 5. Paragraph 3 of the new bylaws gives U.S. authority to designate unoccupied land for temporary recreational use. My farm is not unoccupied land. It's an active agricultural business. Jason sauntered over, grinning beneath his paintball mask. Actually, we've been planning this course layout for months. Works perfect with the terrain. He gestured to the field where my crops for the Veterans Food Bank had been growing. Had to clear some of that unnecessary vegetation, but it makes for better gameplay. I took photos of everything, the damage to my pristine lawn, the people, the vehicles parked on my property. I documented Jason admitting they'd been planning this for months. When he realized I was recording, he tried to backpedal, but it was too late. The admission was captured. "You need to get these people off my property now," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Or I'm calling the sheriff." Margaret's smirk only widened. "Go ahead. We have all the proper authorizations from the HOA. By the time your complaint works through the system, we'll have established regular use. You might as well accept it." I looked across my devastated property, at the carefully maintained grounds now trampled into mud and marred with paint, and made a decision. This required a tactical response. And tactics were my specialty. "You've made a serious mistake," I told Margaret quietly. "You just turned my peaceful farm into a war zone. And warfare is something I understand better than you could possibly imagine." Back in my house, I made 3 calls. The first was to Sheriff Dawson, who came out to file a report but regretfully explained that without a court order, he couldn't immediately evict people if Margaret was waiving HOA documents, fraudulent or not. "Civil matter for now, Jim," he said sympathetically. "But document everything. I've seen HOAs try to pull fast ones before." The second call was to my lawyer, Rebecca Torres, who specialized in property rights. "They've overstepped badly," she assured me after hearing the details. "But HOA cases can drag out for months, and meanwhile they'll keep doing damage." My third call was to Mike Reynolds, who'd served with me in 3 different countries and now worked in corporate security. Within hours, he'd assembled a team of 4 other veterans who lived within 50 miles of my farm. By that evening, they were gathered in my living room. "We need intelligence," I explained, outlining what had happened. "Classic land grab," said Dave, who'd been our unit's intelligence specialist. "Let's dig deeper on Margaret, her husband, and the son." We divided tasks. Sarah, who now worked in digital security, would examine the online presence of key players and the HOA's digital communications. Mike would leverage his security contacts to run background checks. Luis, with his county government connections, would look into permit applications and zoning requests. Dave would coordinate our findings. What we uncovered over the next 48 hours was more calculated than I'd imagined. Margaret's husband's development company had purchased 6 properties surrounding our neighborhood in the past year, creating a pattern that conspicuously avoided my farm, which sat in the middle. Her son's paintball business was 3 months behind on rent before losing its lease, and he'd applied for business loans citing a new location pending acquisition. Most damning, Luis discovered a preliminary permit inquiry from Margaret's husband's company for a resort recreation zone that included a map with my property outlined as Phase 2 acquisition. Sarah found emails Margaret had sent to select board members discussing how to incentivize problematic homeowners to sell below market value. And the whistleblower on the HOA board provided minutes from unofficial meetings where Margaret had assured members that their actions were legal when they clearly weren't. "She's got political aspirations too," Mike added, showing us a campaign website under construction for Margaret's planned run for county commissioner. One of her platform points is decisive action for community improvement. Forcing out a veteran probably sounds like a good story of tough leadership to her. My farm wasn't just a target of opportunity, it was the centerpiece of a calculated plan. And now I had proof. Rebecca Torres's law office was filled with sunlight and plant life, a stark contrast to the destruction I'd left behind at my farm. She reviewed our evidence methodically, occasionally making notes or nodding. "This is extraordinary," she finally said. "They violated HOA procedures, trespassing laws, property rights, and potentially committed fraud by misrepresenting the bylaws to other homeowners. How quickly can we shut them down?" I asked. "That's the challenge. The courts move slowly, and meanwhile, they'll keep damaging your property every weekend. We need an immediate injunction. We spent 3 hours preparing documentation, with Rebecca occasionally bringing in associates to help expedite the process. By early afternoon, we had a comprehensive legal strategy. I've requested an emergency hearing with Judge Mercer, Rebecca said. He's a property rights advocate and might see us as early as tomorrow. As we worked, my phone rang. It was Luis who'd arranged a meeting with County Commissioner Ramirez. Bring photos of the veterans' food bank crops they destroyed, he advised. Ramirez is up for re-election and has been vocal about supporting veterans' programs. That afternoon, I sat in Commissioner Ramirez's office, methodically showing her photos of the damage, the forged-looking HOA documents, and the crops meant for the veterans' food bank now ruined. Her face darkened as she examined each image. This is outrageous. And you say this Margaret Hilton is planning to run for office. That's what we've discovered, I confirmed. Commissioner Ramirez picked up her phone. Janet, get me someone from code enforcement and zoning immediately, and call the county attorney. Within an hour, I had a temporary county directive prohibiting non-agricultural activities on my property pending review, citing potential zoning violations by the paintball operation. My phone rang again as I left the county offices. It was General Matthews, my former commanding officer. Jim, heard you're having some trouble with civilians invading your AO, he said, military terminology coming back naturally. Area of operations had been our way of referring to our assigned territory. News travels fast, I replied. Mike called me. Listen, son, you've got more resources than you know. 5th Group takes care of its own. I'm making some calls. You focus on your legal fight, but don't forget, you were the best terrain specialist we ever had. Use that. For the first time since discovering the invasion of my farm, I felt a surge of confidence. I had legal proceedings in motion, county officials involved, and the reminder that my military skills were far from obsolete. Time to bring them to bear. Few civilians understand what special reconnaissance actually involves. It's not just about combat. It's about using the environment to your advantage, turning seemingly ordinary terrain into a strategic asset or a defensive barrier. For years, I trained others to see landscapes differently, to identify how natural features could be enhanced for tactical advantage. I spent the next day walking my property with new eyes, not as a farmer, but as the SF terrain specialist I'd been for over 2 decades. Every elevation change, every sightline, every natural drainage route, all of them could be subtly modified to create an environment that appeared normal but functioned according to my design. Meanwhile, my old unit buddies were taking action on other fronts. Sarah had initiated a cyber investigation that led to the discovery that Jason's paintball business had been operating without proper liability insurance, a violation that triggered an immediate audit by the county business licensing department. Mike arrived with Dave and 3 other veterans I'd served with, all casually dressed but moving with the unmistakable awareness of trained operators. We gathered around maps of my property spread across the kitchen table. Your farm is basically a classic military problem set, Dave observed. You've got high ground here and here, natural defilade positions in these areas, and clear fields of fire across these sections. If I were setting up defensive positions, I'd work with what you've already got. We're not setting up defensive positions, I clarified. We're setting up observation and control measures that stay within legal boundaries. For the next 2 days, we implemented what looked like ordinary farm maintenance to any observer. We cleared some drainage ditches, repositioned irrigation equipment, moved hay bales for storage, and trimmed back some tree branches for better sunlight. What we were actually doing was creating zones where paintball players would naturally congregate that were visible from public roads, areas where movement would be channeled in specific directions, and observation points that gave us complete coverage of the property without being detected. I installed new high-definition cameras in locations no one would notice, disguised as birdhouses or hidden in trees. Sarah set them up to upload directly to secure cloud storage that multiple lawyers and county officials now had access to. Luis brought news from his contacts at the permit office. Jason had submitted paperwork for a temporary event venue on my address without my knowledge. The application had been flagged for review due to discrepancies. They're getting desperate, Mike observed. Making mistakes. I received a call from Rebecca. Judge Mercer granted our emergency hearing for Friday morning. The timing's perfect. If they try their paintball invasion again this weekend, they'll be violating a court order, not just trespassing. My former commanding officer called again with more resources. 2 veterans who specialized in drone photography offered to document any future trespassing from the air, completely legally from public roads. By Thursday evening, we transformed my farm in ways invisible to casual observers but which would give us complete tactical control of the situation. Just like we used to prepare battlefields, except this time, the goal wasn't combat, it was evidence collection and exposure. As my friends departed, Mike hung back. Jim, you know what their biggest mistake was? He asked. Picking my property? He shook his head. Thinking you were just some lonely old veteran who'd back down from a bully. They had no idea they were taking on someone who trained to handle situations 1,000 times more complex than this. I looked out over my farm as the sun set. They wanted a paintball warzone, I said quietly. Let's show them why that was a terrible idea. While my military brothers had been helping prepare my property, I'd been quietly reaching out to neighbors. Margaret's reign of HOA terror, it turned out, hadn't been limited to my farm. Thursday evening, we gathered in Tom Jenkins' garage. 10 homeowners who'd experienced Margaret's aggressive tactics. Tom, a retired high school principal, had been threatened with fines for his ham radio antenna. Eliza Chun, who ran a small daycare, had been cited for excessive vehicular traffic. The Rodriguez family had been harassed about their weekend family gatherings being too loud. She told me my rose garden was inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics, said Eleanor Williams, an 82-year-old widow who'd lived in her home for 40 years. Said I needed to plant approved varieties only or face daily fines. One by one, they shared similar stories: arbitrary enforcement, sudden rule changes, targeted harassment. The pattern was clear. Margaret was pressuring certain homeowners, particularly those on larger parcels or in strategic locations. My cousin works at the bank, said Robert Diaz. Margaret's husband's company has a holding company that's been buying properties all through this area. They're assembling land for some big development. We need to organize, I told them. Document everything, share information, attend every HOA meeting as a unified group. They're counting on picking us off individually. By the end of the evening, we'd formed a neighborhood alliance with a communication system and assigned roles. Tom would coordinate documentation. Eliza would organize meeting attendance. Robert would investigate financial connections through his banking contacts. Eleanor Williams surprised everyone by revealing she'd been meticulously documenting every HOA interaction for years. My late husband was a lawyer, she explained. He taught me to keep records. I have minutes from meetings going back 15 years that prove they're not following their own bylaws. I also contacted Brian Cooper at the local newspaper, who'd done investigative pieces on development controversies before. Without revealing our full strategy, I shared enough about the paintball invasion to pique his interest. Sounds like there might be a bigger story here, he said. I'll start digging into these connections. The director of the Veterans Food Bank, Maria Vasquez, provided written documentation of our crop donation agreements and the impact of the destruction on their food assistance programs. We've had to cancel our fresh vegetable distributions for 3 weeks because of this, she said. That affects over 60 veteran families who count on that food. By Friday morning, what had started as Margaret's attack on one isolated farmer had evolved into a community-wide resistance with legal, media, and government components already in motion. The stage was set for the weekend. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. From my kitchen window, I watched as the first vehicles turned into my driveway. Margaret's white SUV leading a caravan of cars and trucks loaded with paintball equipment. Jason's van with the Tactical Zone logo followed close behind. Through my earpiece, I heard Mike's voice. Observers in position. Drone teams standing by. Sheriff's deputies are parked 1 mile down the road. Ready when you give the word. I watched through binoculars as they began unloading equipment, looking confused at the subtle changes to the landscape. The hay bales they'd previously used as barriers had been neatly stacked, in locations that made them useless as cover. The flat area they'd used as a staging ground now had a drainage ditch running through it that channeled movement exactly where we wanted it. "They're setting up in zones 3 and 4, Dave reported from his observation position. "Moving right where we anticipated." Margaret was directing people with aggressive hand gestures, clearly frustrated by the changed terrain. Jason was arguing with his employees about course layout, gesturing at areas that no longer worked for their purposes. "County inspector vehicle approaching from the south," Sarah reported. "Right on schedule." I watched as a county vehicle drove slowly past my property. The inspector inside was taking photos of the obvious trespassing, creating another layer of official documentation. For 2 hours, I let them struggle to set up their course. Each time they adapted to one challenge, they encountered another. Equipment malfunctioned. The terrain channeled players into muddy areas. The course they finally established was completely visible from the county road, a clear code violation. At precisely 11:30 a.m., when they had fully committed their resources and had dozens of witnesses present, I emerged from the treeline wearing tactical gear and holding a professional-grade paintball marker. I raised a bullhorn to my lips. "Attention everyone on my property. Since you've turned my farm into a paintball warzone, let me show you why I was the best in my unit." The confused players turned toward my voice. Before anyone could react, I moved with the speed and precision of my training days, rapidly eliminating a team of players with carefully placed shots. I navigated the terrain with ease, using cover and concealment that the other players hadn't even noticed was available. Within minutes, I had systematically outmaneuvered their best players, including Jason's self-proclaimed champion team, who looked stunned as I eliminated them with textbook military tactics adapted for paintball. Margaret's face had transformed from confusion to horror as she watched me dominate the very game they had forced onto my property. Jason was shouting instructions to his players, who were being picked off one by one. After demonstrating my superior skills beyond any doubt, I stopped and raised the bullhorn again. "Everyone needs to cease fire and gather by the entrance immediately. You are all trespassing on private property." As if on cue, 2 sheriff's vehicles pulled into my driveway, followed by Rebecca's car and a van from the local news station. The carefully orchestrated timing was perfect. We had allowed them to fully establish their illegal activity before bringing in the authorities. Sheriff Dawson approached Margaret, who was still trying to maintain her composure. "Mrs. Hilton, I have a court order here prohibiting any non-agricultural activities on this property," he said, handing her the document Rebecca had secured the previous day. "Everyone needs to vacate immediately. This is HOA-approved recreational use," Margaret insisted, her voice rising. "We have documentation, which directly contradicts county zoning regulations and was obtained without proper homeowner notification," Rebecca interrupted, stepping forward with another folder of documents. "We have affidavits from board members stating they were misled about the legality of these actions. And we have footage of the damage to crops designated for veteran food assistance," added Commissioner Ramirez, who had arrived with the news crew. "The county takes a very dim view of this kind of activity." Margaret's face cycled through shock, anger, and panic as she realized how completely she'd been outmaneuvered, legally, tactically, and publicly. Her son Jason was frantically trying to direct his employees to pack up equipment as players streamed toward the exit. "You planned this?" Margaret hissed at me, finally understanding what had happened. "No, Margaret," I replied calmly, loud enough for the news cameras to catch. "You planned an illegal takeover of a veteran's farm for your personal gain. I just defended what's mine, using every legal means at my disposal." As the paintballers evacuated my property under the watchful eyes of the sheriff's deputies, the drone captured overhead footage of the entire scene, Margaret's defeat, the orderly departure of the trespassers, and the comprehensive documentation of the damage they'd caused. The sheriff approached with paperwork. "We'll need statements from everyone. And Mrs. Hilton, the county attorney wants to speak with you about these fraudulent HOA documents." The emergency HOA meeting the following Tuesday had record attendance. Every chair was filled, with people standing along the walls of the community center meeting room. Margaret sat at the board table, looking significantly less confident than usual. Rebecca presented our evidence methodically. The illegal bylaw changes, the fraudulent documents, the property damage, the conflicts of interest Margaret had concealed from the community. The whistleblower board member confirmed that they had been misled about the legality of their actions. Each board member who voted for these illegal actions while being aware of their illegality is personally liable for damages, Rebecca explained. HOA insurance typically doesn't cover intentional violations of the law. The color drained from the faces of several board members. One of them, a nervous accountant named Howard, immediately resigned his position, followed quickly by two others. Brian Cooper from the local newspaper was taking notes in the front row. His investigation into Margaret's connections to the development company now a front-page story. The county business licensing department had suspended Jason's paintball operation pending review of multiple violations. The county commissioner has ordered a complete audit of all HOA activities for the past year, Brian announced to the crowd. And Margaret's husband's company is distancing itself from the situation, issuing a statement that they had no knowledge of her actions. Margaret's political aspirations evaporated as news spread of her attempt to force out a veteran who had been growing food for other veterans. Her campaign website disappeared overnight. When the vote of no confidence in the board was called, it passed overwhelmingly. By the end of the meeting, a new interim board had been elected, including Tom Jenkins and Eleanor Williams, people committed to returning the HOA to its original purpose of maintaining the rural character of the neighborhood rather than facilitating development schemes. Commissioner Ramirez announced new county protections for agricultural properties within HOAs, citing my case as an example of why such regulations were necessary. Several neighboring communities with HOA issues reached out for advice on how to organize similar resistance. The final victory came when Margaret's husband's development company was ordered to pay restoration costs for all properties that had been damaged through HOA harassment, as part of a settlement to avoid further legal action and public relations damage. Jason's paintball business never reopened. The bank foreclosed on his equipment after multiple loan defaults. As for my farm, what had been intended as its destruction became its rebirth. The community that had come together to fight Margaret's abuse now rallied to help repair the damage to my fields. 1 year later, my farm had not only recovered but expanded. The Veterans Program had grown from occasional donations to a structured initiative where former service members could come to learn farming techniques, find peace working the land, and connect with others who understood their experiences. The new HOA structure protected agricultural uses and even created incentives for sustainable farming practices. Several other properties had started small garden operations, inspired by what they'd seen at my place. Former antagonistic board members found themselves volunteering at the Veterans Garden, partly out of community service requirements from legal settlements, but some continuing long after those obligations ended. Howard, the accountant who had quickly resigned, became one of our most dedicated volunteers, finding his own healing in the work. In a fitting twist of irony, the very field where paintballs once flew now became our most beautiful green space. The area transformed into a serene landscape perfect for veterans' mindfulness sessions. We called it Redemption Field and dedicated it to veterans' healing and community gatherings. The community alliance formed during the conflict evolved into a neighborhood council that addressed concerns collaboratively rather than through enforcement and fines. Property values increased naturally as the area became known for its community spirit and sustainable practices. Margaret's husband's development company sold their surrounding properties to a land conservation trust, ensuring they would remain undeveloped. I was working in my front garden when a moving truck passed by. Behind it was Margaret's white SUV, packed with belongings. She stopped briefly, rolling down her window. "How did you do it?" she asked, a question that seemed to have haunted her. "How did you outmaneuver me so completely?" I straightened up, looking her in the eye. "You saw land to exploit. I saw terrain to defend. And I've been defending terrain my entire life." She drove away without another word. Standing among the veterans working in the fields, watching neighbors chatting as they walked the farm paths that were now community trails, I felt a deep satisfaction. They thought turning my peaceful farm into a war zone would drive me away. Instead, it just reminded me how to turn chaos back into peace. That's what we do.